Welcome to the podcast, Tis But a Scratch, fact and fiction about the Middle Ages. I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. This is the fourth of a multi-episode series on adultery in the Middle Ages. My co-host for the series is Professor Larissa Tracy. To be frank, this is really episode 43B of the podcast. When Kat and I were recording the previous episode on how medieval adultery has been portrayed in modern popular culture, and in particular, how writers and filmmakers have dealt with the love stories of Lancelot and Guinevere and of Tristan and Iseult, we discovered we had too much to cover to squeeze into my target length for an episode of 1 hour. So we decided to cut the recording in two and have a separate episode dealing with medieval adultery as portrayed in the movies. This is that separate episode. Okay, we can finally turn to medieval adultery in the movies. And there are a lot of them.
Absolutely, there's so much of it.
There is so much of it. As of 2014, when Virginia Blanton, Marsha Johnson Olin, and Charlene Average compiled a very useful annotated hand list of medieval women in film, there were at least 50.
Wow, that's it.
And there have been several since. I shouldn't be surprised at the number of medieval films that touch on adultery, given the continuing popularity of the Lancelot and Guinevere and Tristan and Iseult stories. Fortunately, we can exclude the 10 filmed performances of Wagner's opera Tristan and Iseult, the 2004 film performance of Riccardo Zandoni's early 20th century Italian opera Francesca da Rimini, based on the story in Dante's Inferno, and a dozen silent films, but that still leaves us with too many to talk about. Over the last couple of weeks, I tried to watch as many of these movies as I could, and some of them were just awful to me.
Well, see, if I haven't seen all of them.
No. Well, that's what happens when you're still working. I'm retired, and I can always claim to Ellen that I'm watching these movies as research for my podcast. So we'll have to be very selective in our choice of films to discuss. Let's start with a few non-Arthurian movies that feature adultery, and then segue to the Arthurian films.
Okay.
There are several big-budget medieval epics that feature adultery in their plot lines. One of them is a movie that I never get tired bashing for its historical inaccuracies, Ridley Scott's The Kingdom of Heaven. Scott and William Monahan, who wrote the screenplay, invented a completely ahistorical, adulterous love story between the Princess Sibylla, wife of Guy of Lusignan and sister of the leper king Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, and Balian of Ibelin. The movie's hero, Balian, is the bastard son of a crusader baron. At the beginning of the movie, he is a blacksmith in a French village. His father, Godfrey, needing an heir, seeks him out and persuades him to return with him to the Holy Land. The film actually lost me at this point. What is historically wrong with this, you might ask? Everything. The historical Balian was the legitimate youngest son of Barison, or as he was also known, Balian I of Ibelin, one of the prime political movers and shakers in the early years of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. I have no idea why the screenplay writers decided to rename him Godfrey. The real Balian, like his two older brothers, was born in Outremer, that is the Latin Levant, and he grew up in his father's and his brother's courts. He became Lord of Ibelin in 1170, some 17 years before the movie begins. Need I add that he wasn't a blacksmith? And I can imagine the proud Balian spinning in his grave at the idea that he was a blacksmith. But this episode is about adultery in the movies, so let's get to the adultery in the Kingdom of Heaven. At any rate, when Balian meets Sibylla, sparks fly. A young widow with a small child, Sibylla is now married to an arrogant, scheming, intolerant, and bloodthirsty waste of space named Guy of Lusignan. Again, as a historian, my head spun at this. The historical marriage between Sibylla and Guy was a love story. In reality, Guy was pretty much what Balian is in the film, not a blacksmith, but a good-looking French knight from a noble family who had only recently arrived in Outremer. Sibylla wanted him as a husband and took him as her husband despite the opposition of much of the native barons, including the powerful Balian clan. The only thing that is historically correct about this is that Guy and Balian belong to different political factions. But Guy in the movie is mainly interested in Sibylla because she is the key to him obtaining the throne after the death of her brother, who is wasting away from leprosy. Guy is scheming with the crazy Reynaud of Chatillon to break the peace with the Muslims so that he can wage a war of conquest. Baldwin, a wise and compassionate and tolerant king, is horrified at the prospect of Guy succeeding him. He wants the crown to pass to his young nephew. He sees the impressive young Balian as the solution to his problem. Knowing that Sibylla and Balian have a thing going, Baldwin summons Balian to meet with him and his chief advisor, Raymond III of Tripoli, who for reasons only known to the screenplay writers is called Tiberius in the movie, and makes him an offer.
We have decided that you shall take command of the army of Jerusalem. Will you defend my nephew?
Whatever you ask.
Hear it all before you answer. Would you marry my sister Sibylla were she free of Guy de Lusignan?
He would be executed, along with his knights who do not sway your allegiance.
I cannot be the cause of that.
Whatever you ask, I would serve.
A king may move a man, you said, but the soul belongs to the man.
Yes, I did.
You have my love and my answer.
So be it.
Why do you protect him? He's a man who insults you, who hates you, will kill you himself if he had the chance. For the salvation of this kingdom, will it be so hard to marry Sibylla? Jerusalem has no need of a perfect knight.
No, it is a kingdom of conscience or nothing.
What I really love is Balian has such a discriminating conscience, complicity in the killing of the husband of the woman that he loves. No, that's beyond me. But adultery, yeah, that's okay. Something like that.
This from somebody who is having.
But that's the point. That point is that he has all of this resistance to going ahead and marrying her, but he goes ahead and has
shags her anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, and at the end of the film, they go back to France, where he takes up his old trade as a blacksmith, and she, having resigned the queenship in the most ahistorical way ever, is now happily married to a blacksmith.
Yeah. And this is the thing about films like Kingdom of Heaven. There are some good parts to it, and then there's some atrocious parts to it. A lot of that movie makes my head explode. An equally head-exploding film that involves medieval adultery is, of course, Braveheart. That film is so bad. As I explained, the only accurate part of the last 5 minutes when he's being hanged, drawn, and quartered and castrated. And that stops in accuracy when he screams freedom. But
wouldn't you scream freedom? I would have screamed, ah!
Right before they cut off her head. But the implication in Braveheart is that he seduces Isabella, the wife of Edward II.
And he impregnates her.
And the implication of that Edward II is gay and that he's effeminate. This unbelievably toxic masculine film.
But does it explain to you how you could have Edward III
and all of their siblings? Yeah,
Edward II had 2 legitimate sons. One was Edward III, had 2 legitimate daughters, and a bastard son, which would have been inconceivable for the Prince Edward of this movie. Sorry, couldn't resist. But then again, the screenplay writers are channeling the Elizabethan playwright Christopher Marlowe's play, The Troublesome Reign and the Lamentable Death of Edward II, King of England, which pretty much guaranteed that Edward would be remembered as both gay and ineffectual. Historians are less certain about the gay part. And not to put too fine a point on it, but William Wallace was executed in 1305 and Edward III was born in 1312. That's one hell of a long gestation period.
But I know that they're probably passing a nod.
Just because Isabella was 10 years old and was still in Paris.
Yes, it's totally irrelevant to that whole plot line. But that is the problem, is that you get that film like Braveheart, where Isabella is played by Sophie Marceau. She's an adult. She's a woman.
And not a 10-year-old kid.
This overly masculine Braveheart running around in anachronistic kilts because William Wallace was a Norman
himself
knight.
Blue.
Yes.
They apparently knew about the pics.
Of course they did, and painted themselves in various blue patterns. All of that movie is nonsense, but particularly the adultery aspect. What it does is it creates this idea that that's what the Middle Ages were like.
It does. Braveheart's portrayal of adultery is almost refreshingly free of guilt and shame. It's clear that Prince Edward not only is unworthy of Isabella, but isn't in the least bit interested in her as a woman. William Wallace, on the other hand, is both, and Isabella can provide him with the solace that he needs to recover from the rape and death of his beloved wife. In this movie, as in Kingdom of Heaven, adultery between two good-looking people, one of whom has a loser husband, is something to celebrate. Okay, one last non-Arthurian medieval movie that has adultery, or at least alleged adultery in it, is The Last Duel, again directed by the prolific... Before I'm accused of being a Ridley Scott hater, I'll put in a plug for his science fiction films Alien, Blade Runner, The Martian, and with a bit less enthusiasm, Prometheus. It's only his historical epics that I have real problems with. And I have less of a problem with The Last Duel than I have with Kingdom of Heaven or with Ridley Scott's Robin Hood. The Last Duel is a big-budgeted prestige film costing more than $100 million to make, but grossing less than half that, and stars Matt Damon, Jodie Comer, Adam Driver, and Ben Affleck. The movie is based on a non-fiction book of the same name by the medieval literature specialist Eric Jager, and is based on a historical event. In 1386, the Norman knight Jean de Carouge fought a trial by combat to the death against his former friend Jacques Legris. Carouge had accused Legris of having raped his wife Marguerite. After Legris's patron and lord, Count Pierre d'Alençon, found in favor of Legris, Carouge appealed the decision to King Charles VI of France, asking for and being granted a trial by combat to determine guilt or innocence. All that is historically accurate. The movie, however, takes a Rashomon approach to the story.
I had to stop watching that movie because in the first 5 minutes of the movie, we had to stop because we realized it would take us 5 hours to watch it because we'd stop it every 5 minutes to complain. So I could not sit through that whole movie.
The movie has 3 stories in it because each of the characters are going to tell...
point of view.
And that's why it's the Rashomon approach, which is always good for historians because everybody has a different perspective, but the perspectives are really different in here.
Very much so,
And the middle perspective by the accused rapist, this man about town, highly educated, and part of a court that is hedonistic, to say the least, Jacques Legris, says that it's not rape, but it was seduction. It was a romantic seduction.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, neither the outraged husband nor the wronged woman, who her version is supposed to be the real version,
would know.
It's rape.
Of course it is.
Rape.
Well, and this becomes a testament to the fraught discussions of rape in the Middle Ages itself, and that is a whole nother story and episode. But this presumption, again, that movie is a product of this time.
Yes, it is.
Where it's the he said, she said, and we're going to fight a duel about it.
That's exactly what it is. It's a product of our time.
Of our time now, and one that is a passing nod to a medieval source text.
I did like the scene in which the female friends of the victim, Marguerite de Carouge, believe her to be guilty of adultery because she had made comments about how handsome Jacques Legris was. they assume that she has committed adultery, and therefore what they do is they freeze her out.
They refuse to defend her. I mean, this again is no different than a trial now where the survivor is accused, well, you flirted, well, you said something nice, well, you talked to them, well, you wore this. And it is the medieval equivalent of the witness.
It is. It's exactly that. I actually liked this movie better than you did, and I classify medieval movies as the good, the bad, and the not so bad. And I put this in the not so bad category. I talk about it in fact, this podcast's second episode with my good old friend, Carol Fletcher. And if you haven't listened to that episode, you might want to. Okay, let's turn to movies about Lancelot and Guinevere and Tristan and Iseult. After all, they have been the focus of our discussions for the last 3 episodes. So let's take a look at a few of the more prominent versions of these stories in cinema. Unlike the movies we've just looked at, in which adultery is pretty incidental, in these movies, adultery is one of the main driving forces of the plot. They are about forbidden love. They are about a forbidden passion and the conflict between love and duty.
That idea of the buildup of love plays a huge part in the popular culture iterations of both the Lancelot and Guinevere and the Tristan and Iseult stories, especially when you get into film, because that dramatic tension is are they really going to engage in adultery or not, and how much of that is love that starts before the potion, what part does it play? And when you get into cinema, the way that adultery is portrayed, particularly in those 2 storylines, is always about, we have to resist, we can't, whoa, but we must, oh no, we did, now what?
Yeah, that's the basic plot line for these stories. They're not that much different from sitcoms, except that sitcoms are funny and these aren't. But let's begin with a movie which violates that. A movie in which Lancelot and Guinevere fall madly in love, but they don't do it. Knights of the Round Table was a 1953 British epic made by MGM in England and Ireland, and it was a big cast. It starred Robert Taylor as Lancelot, Ava Gardner as Guinevere, Mel Ferrer as King Arthur, and it is based very, very heavily on Malory.
It is, and it really tries to capture some of the contradictions in Malory as well.
But it is a movie in which the Lancelot and Guinevere story is one of suppressed passion, of love which is expressed to one another, love which they both feel, but love
never acted on.
Never acted on.
No.
And the reason for that?
It's because of love of Arthur.
Yes, but they can't do it because once the code came in, if you had adultery in a movie after 1933, then the adulteress had to pay a price.
Right. And I mean, Am I being cynical
about this?
Well, no, you're not being cynical, because that is the technical reason for it. But I actually showed an excerpt of this movie to my students a few weeks ago, and it's really quite touching when Lancelot says that it's the love of Arthur that has kept them from doing anything. And that adultery never realizes itself. It's adultery of the heart, it's adultery of the will, but they never act on it. And it's probably because of the regulations of the cinema, but it's also a very moving speech where she's been accused, he's been accused, and he says, no, we would not. And it really is a touching scene.
It is a touching scene. I know that you haven't seen Cornel Wilde's The Sword of Lancelot. I only watched it a few days ago. The title made it sound like a cheesy adventure film, and I've seen a number of movies starring Cornel Wilde, and he struck me as an unlikely Lancelot. With so many possible films to choose from, I thought we could safely pass over this one. But then I read a synopsis of the movie in Bert Colton's Arthurian Legends on Film and Television, and knew I had to see it for this episode. It was released in 1963 and marketed as a big budget. I'm not sure how big the budget really was, but as a big budget medieval epic. It's another take on the Arthurian legend, and one that's quite different from the Knights of the Round Table. And what makes this movie really important for this particular episode is that it's the first movie in which the adulterous love of Lancelot and Guinevere takes center stage.
Wow, that's it.
The Sword of Lancelot was released in Britain as Lancelot and Guinevere, which is a much more appropriate title for this particular film, unless, of course, the Sword of Lancelot was meant as a double entendre, and I don't think it was. Cornel Wilde was a popular leading man in the mid-1940s. In the 1950s, Wilde and his second wife, Jean Wallace, formed their own production company, and Wilde became a sort of B-movie Orson Welles, producing, directing, and acting in 9 films between 1955 and 1975. The Sword of Lancelot was the 5th of those films. Wilde and Wallace star as Lancelot and Guinevere, and a much older Brian Aherne plays a much older King Arthur. As the title suggests, Universal released the film as a swashbuckling epic, and the movie begins with a brutal duel in which Lancelot wins Guinevere and sovereignty over Britain for Arthur, and it has 2 large-scale battle scenes. But they're not what the movie is about. It's really about Lancelot and Guinevere's love affair. Their relationship in this movie is unambiguously sexual, and although Lancelot wrestles with his sense of duty and honor, Guinevere is just head over heels in love with him and pushes their relationship forward. They fall for each other as Lancelot escorts her to Camelot after winning her in combat. She's clearly taken with him immediately. Lancelot and Guinevere make camp by a pool and bathe together. He is bare-chested. She's in a scanty sheath. Guinevere eyes Lancelot washing.
Oh my.
And sends her female attendant, who happens to be Vivian in this movie, away to get her a warm robe when she comes out. But what she's really doing is she's trying to get some time alone with Lancelot. Wilde, who wrote the screenplay, winks at the Tristan story in this scene. His Lancelot is French. The Hungarian-born Wilde was fluent in French. He's also cultivated. He can read and write Latin and spends quiet time reading Horace. He's also the consummate courtier as well as the warrior. He knows how to flirt with the ladies, joke with his fellow knights, and give good advice to the king. He also has discovered soap.
Oh my goodness.
In the pool scene, Guinevere is amazed at Lancelot rubbing soap on him and sudsing up, and is delighted to try it. But then she says it makes her feel odd, and she draws back cautiously. She asks whether it's some kind of magic, and she's heard stories about Merlin. And Merlin in this movie isn't a wizard. He's not a magician. He's just an elderly wise advisor. Lancelot, with mock seriousness, tells her that it's a love ointment, and then laughingly tells her what it really is. She splashes him, he dunks her, and then they frolic until they're interrupted by Vivian returning with the robe, and Vivian knows what's going on. The die is cast at that point. At least it's cast for Guinevere. The escort party is then ambushed by ruffians hired by Mordred, Arthur's bastard son. Mordred wants to kill Guinevere because he knows that if she marries his father and bears him a legitimate heir, there goes any chance he has to succeed to the throne. Lancelot saves Guinevere, and she, in turn, saves him by striking an attacker on the head with a sword. Guinevere in this movie is a proud tomboy, and when the ruffians have been either killed or chased off, she tells Lancelot how she feared for his life because it was as dear to her as her own. At which point Lancelot, clearly already smitten but fighting it, tells her, quote, "You must say no more or we will lose all of our honor," end quote. And she tearfully asks him whether he values honor above all. And he replies, "I must, my lady, and so must you." This is not really a movie about conflicted love or a triangle in which each party loves the other two. The movie's author, played by Brian Ahern, is much older than Guinevere and Lancelot. He's a father figure to both of them. Lancelot is the finest of his knights, and he appreciates that. He also trusts Lancelot because of Lancelot's devotion to duty. Arthur's marriage is political, but it's clear from the very beginning of the movie that Arthur is looking forward to marrying the golden-haired young Guinevere who he had seen some time ago. He calls her child, and she is easily young enough to be his child. Arthur has the hots for her and is impatient to marry her and consummate the marriage. She isn't. She is, in fact, incredibly unhappy at the prospect, but she hides it in public. She can't help but notice how Lancelot looks at her. As Lancelot escorts her down the aisle to an eager Arthur, she tells him she wants to escape. He reproaches her, saying that she should be the happiest and proudest of maidens in all Britain. And she responds, quote, "My head wanted it, not my heart," end quote. Even worse, as they make their way toward Arthur, she whispers to Lancelot, "Save me before it's too late," to which he replies, "It is already too late." And Guinevere makes certain that it's too late in all senses. Lancelot has been avoiding being alone with her. She knows that. And she, for her part, has been playing the role of happy young wife, assuring her husband that she really does love him. Lancelot's evasions come to an end when Arthur orders him to stay behind from a hunt. Guinevere, the tomboy, wants to go on the hunt with Arthur, and that she grew up hunting with her father. But Arthur responds that it goes against the customs of Camelot, and that he would not expose her to such danger. It may have been what she did when she grew up, but not in Camelot. And Guinevere tells Arthur that she's so bored. She doesn't want to hear all this gossip from her ladies in waiting. The ladies of the court are boring her. And Arthur says, "I'll tell you what, I'll leave Lancelot behind and he can tell you all about his adventures." Arthur really is clueless, but then again, Guinevere plays her part really well. The hunting party rides off, leaving Lancelot and Guinevere behind. She accuses him of avoiding her since the wedding. He denies it. Both of them have been just so busy, he tells her. But Lancelot, finding this conversation awkward, asks to take his leave. He needs time to himself, and in this movie, Lancelot has his own happy place. It's a spot in the royal garden where he can get away from the court and sit and read his favorite Latin authors without anyone bothering him. While Lancelot is quietly reading Horace, Guinevere enters the garden and asks if she can sit beside him. She then asks him what he's reading, and he tells her the Roman philosopher Horace. She asks about his philosophy, and he tells her that it is to be content with what one has and not to try to reach for the unattainable. Guinevere asks Lancelot about writing. Apparently there's nothing written in the vernacular in this version of medieval Britain. And then she says, "How does one say and how does one write 'I love you' in Latin?" Lancelot responds, "Amo te," and scratches the words on the ground right beside Guinevere's feet. And that does it. They look at each other, they embrace, they kiss, and the affair is on. The garden becomes the place they meet and make love, much like the love grotto in Gottfried von Strasbourg's Tristan. The movie then follows the basic plot in Mallory, Lancelot knowing that the love affair can only end in tragedy, and riddled with guilt about his disloyalty to Arthur, decides to return to France, and not a moment too soon. Guinevere, believing that Lancelot had been killed in battle, succumbs to grief. Arthur is sorry to lose his best knight and friend, but even he can't ignore his wife's excessive reaction, especially when the word is being slipped him by Mordred. The only way out for the lovers is to part. Guinevere begs Lancelot not to leave her, and when he is adamant, she persuades him to spend one last night with her. Lancelot, knowing it's a bad idea, can't resist, and they make love. They are caught in the morning. Lancelot fights his way out, inadvertently killing an unarmored friend of his, Gareth, the brother of Gawain. Guinevere is seized, and, as the adulterous wife of the king, is condemned to be burnt at the stake. As in Mallory, Lancelot comes to the rescue, whisks Guinevere off of a burning pyre, and takes her back to his castle. Arthur besieges it, and Arthur and Gawain both challenge Lancelot to single combat, but Lancelot, knowing that he would win, refuses. Guinevere points out that those two men are trying to burn her at the stake, and that if he loves her, he will protect her, and the best way to do that is to kill Arthur. Lancelot agrees to fight Gawain, defeats him, and of course spares him. Arthur sends another challenge, and when Merlin arrives as the king's messenger, Guinevere is almost girlishly happy. She assumes that Lancelot has accepted the challenge, Merlin is there to arrange for the combat, and that she's soon going to be a widow. But she is disappointed to learn that Lancelot instead has made a deal with Arthur, whom she contemptuously calls, quote, a dealer in roasted women in the marketplace, and that deal is to save her life. He will go back to France in exile, and she will go into a convent. Guinevere reproaches Lancelot for abandoning her. He responds by telling her, quote, I have lost track lately of friendship with a few other things, loyalty, duty, honor. Guinevere suggests that they flee together to France, and he tells her bitterly that she's speaking like a child. Everybody tells her she's a child. Your author, he says, will uphold the law. Do you think that they would give us peace, the Queen of Britain and a traitorous knight? There would be no haven for us anywhere. But he then adds that there is hope for them in the future. The world Arthur knows is dying, Lancelot says, and you will be safe until I come for you, a widow and not of my making. As I said, Arthur is old in this movie. As in Mallory, Arthur dies in battle defending his kingdom against Mordred. This happens off-screen. Unlike in Mallory, Mordred survives the battle and is ravaging the kingdom with his barbarian allies. The author of The Sword of Lancelot is not the hero of legend. He isn't a bad king. He's just an old one, and vulnerable without the support of Lancelot. A wounded Gawain, who has now forgiven Lancelot for the killing of Gareth, seeks Lancelot out in Brittany to tell him the news of Arthur's death at the hands of Mordred, and to ask him to return to save the kingdom from Mordred and his barbarian allies. Lancelot tells him that he has had enough of killing, but changes his mind when Gawain reveals that Mordred has attacked Glastonbury, the convent where Guinevere was sheltered. Guinevere escaped unharmed, but the threat remains. At this point, Lancelot changes his tune. He has not had enough of killing, and won't until Mordred is dead. Lancelot, of course, leads the good guys to victory, pursues a fleeing Mordred, and kills him. Nothing now stands in the way of the happiness of Lancelot and Guinevere, except for maybe the motion picture production code. Lancelot seeks Guinevere out in the convent, and she greets him in the habit of a novice. He's relieved that she hasn't yet taken vows, and without a hint of irony says, "Thank God I am in time. Did you think I would not come?" But then she tells him that in their year apart, she has changed. She has found God and now prays for forgiveness of her sins. She intends to take the vows. Lancelot, to his dismay, has lost her to God. Lancelot's expression changes from happiness to confusion and then to dismay. His pleas fail against her newfound faith, and reluctantly and sadly he leaves the convent, never to see his love again. The end. Like Kingdom of Heaven, the sword of Lancelot really is understanding and forgiving about adultery, if that adultery is between two young, good-looking people, and if the husband, in this case, isn't a jerk, but is just too old. We have, in 1974, a French film, Lancelot du Lac, which was written and directed by Robert Bresson, and I know you haven't seen it.
I have not.
It's a good film. It's gritty. It's the Middle Ages as nasty and brutal and gritty, and it has the story of Lancelot and Guinevere in it, and it doesn't pull punches with it. The round table is falling apart in this. It's worth seeing. But
And it sounds very much like the French versions of the Arthuriana in the first place.
And it probably is based upon that.
Probably.
Then you have in 1981, Excalibur.
Oh, Excalibur. That film is extraordinary on so many levels. And not least of which because it incorporates Tristan and Iseult, the Wagner's music at the beginning.
Oh, yeah.
Dwelling as you are then confronted with the image of the Dark Ages, and it's very dark as Uther Pendragon in his 15th century plate armor is fighting all of these warlords badly, with swords by the way, because that's not how you fight with swords, and then Merlin appears out of nowhere with that shiny dome of his that is literally quite shiny.
Nicole Williamson.
It is. Nicole Williamson, a brilliant Welsh actor who was also Little John in the 1976 Robin and Marian.
And I can't watch that now without thinking of Tim the Enchanter from Monty Python.
Well, and what kills me about Excalibur is that it's 1981. Monty Python and the Holy Grail is 1975. That came out first, and they still did all of that.
Yes,
with Excalibur.
it really did.
And when the Lady of the Lake holds aloft Excalibur, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords as no basis for a system of government is all I can think of, because it's almost like John Borman saw Monty Python and said, "Hold my beer, I'm going to make this real." And that film is extraordinary in the way it presents Arthur and Igraine. It has the most uncomfortable sex scene ever filmed. That is Uther Pendragon in full 15th century play. But the worst part about that is actually the actress who plays Igraine is John Borman's daughter.
Really?
Yes. And she has been on record saying how traumatic it was to do that scene, because in order to make it look like it's varying between Colin Redgrave and Gabriel Byrne, they had to do it twice. And so she had to do it first with Colin Redgrave, and then she had to do it with Gabriel Byrne, and her father's directing it. And it's just, for her, it was really traumatic, which I understand.
I would think it would be traumatic for her father.
Well, he's the one who directed it, and he insisted that they just keep doing it over and over. And she never acted again, apparently, after this.
But what you really like is the actor who played Lancelot.
Oh my goodness. Now that Lancelot the Hairless in this film. The character, the actor who plays Lancelot,
Nicholas Clay?
Yes, Nicholas Clay. In this film, he is so upright, and he is the quintessential knight in shining armor. In fact, his armor is so shiny, and it has the grail on it for some inexplicable reason, and he just doesn't have to act, because he just stands there. He's so wooden, he's so immovable. Even in his love for Guinevere, he never really shows much emotion, except when he's wrestling with himself naked in the woods, as you do, because apparently you wear nothing under your full plate shiny armor, and then you fight
that must
the sword.
really hurt.
Talk about chafing.
Yeah, really.
And he is at one point wrestling with himself in order to be able to exonerate Guinevere in a trial by combat, because Gawain, of all people, has accused her of adultery. And this is a Gawain played by an exceptionally young, very drunk, boorish Liam Neeson. And this is one of the extraordinary things about Excalibur. It has a phenomenal cast.
It does. It really does.
It has Gabriel Byrne. It has Helen Mirren, Liam Neeson, even Nigel Terry, who plays Arthur, had just come off of, well, a number of years before, in A Lion in Winter, he's Prince John. I love how they expect you to think he's 15 at the beginning of that movie, because he's not, even remotely. Nicole Williams. I mean, it's got a wonderful cast. And Boorman at least was trying to capture the idea of the Arthurian world.
I agree, but it's the 15th century Arthurian world of Mallory that he's trying to capture, which is why he uses 15th century armor.
And he does succeed in that. And the affair of Lancelot and Guinevere, again, is one that is almost unrequited. I say almost.
Almost.
Almost. But you don't really believe it, because Lancelot going to Ireland to fetch Guinevere, daughter of King Leodegrance, played by Sir Patrick Stewart. And, I mean, there you go. Sir Patrick Stewart is Leodegrance. And they're on their way, they're on the road, and all the girls are tittling about, oh, they're looking at him and twittering. And Sherry Lungy, with her Irish accent, says to him, oh, they want to know if any of them could capture your heart. And he's like, my heart belongs to another. And she said, oh, who is it? Some lady must inspire you. And he says, there is one. And she's like, who is it? Go on, you can tell me. And he said, it is you. I will only ever love you. I will love you as the wife of my king. I will love you as the wife of my best friend. And she has this look on her face. She's gobsmacked. And she's like, And her horse kind of stops and falls behind. But we have no reason to understand why he loves her. There's no real build-up to that at all.
She's beautiful. What else?
And
what
apparently
do you need?
that's all you
It's
need.
a medieval trope.
Exactly. And in this instance, she realizes that, and then you cut straight to the very interesting wedding ceremony between Arthur and Guinevere.
Yeah, but not as interesting as sort of Lancelot's, no, I don't want to marry Arthur.
Almost every King Arthur movie has to have the wedding scene between Arthur and Guinevere. And that love seems to build. He keeps himself away from court, and it's almost like she falls in love with him because now she can't have him. And because he's professed his love for her and gone away. And then Gawain calls them out. He has to come back, and he wins that battle because Percival was going to fight for her. It's this very strange mishmash. But eventually they do once have sex. And the one time they have sex, naked in the forest, as you do, strange choice, but okay. That's when Arthur sees it. Arthur realizes that this has happened, and he catches them. He sees them sleeping. He takes out Excalibur, and he drives it into the ground between them. Merlin sees this from his crystal cave when he's with Morgana, who's trying to get the spell of making, which is actually an old Irish annals verse that he uses. And that's when Merlin realized the spine of the dragon is broken. And then, of course, it goes into the Grail quest for some inexplicable reason.
Because that's what Mallory does.
And it does. Though Mallory's narrative, of course, is very disjointed.
But I know there is one Arthurian movie that you like even better than Excalibur. And am I wrong?
Night.
The First Night.
First
Isn't
Night. That is such a bad movie.
This is a movie that I know you're very fond of. Because when you think about Lancelot, you immediately think about Richard Gere. Yeah.
Not at all. Yes, this film, 1996.
I believe so.
Yes, is the quintessential product of the 1990s sensitive masculinity. It's kind of a response to the 1980s sensitive man who could be both sexy, sensitive, and strong. But in the 90s, they had to reclaim their masculinity and still be kind of sensitive, but really only to each other. Because it's this toxic masculinity backlash that you get in this movie. Because, I'm sorry, but Lancelot, who is not a knight at all. No, he's just a sellsword, as we might say. And he's just a man who loves his freedom, and he likes to just go where he goes. And he comes upon Guinevere when she is on her way to marry Arthur of Camelot. She is Guinevere of Lyonesse.
And he hits on her.
He doesn't just hit on her. He saves her. Then he kisses her
out of the blue, and she's very taken aback. And then he says something else and says, well, you can pay me, you know what you can give me. And she slaps him, and he's stunned. And he says,
he's Richard Gere.
He's Richard Gere. How could you not? And she says, you've insulted me. He's like, how have I insulted you? And he says, I know when a woman wants it. Is so cringeworthy because he's sitting there forcing himself on her. And I have to tell my students, I said, no does not mean try harder. But this movie seems to imply that it does. And so he then says to her, I will never kiss you until you ask. And then the whole movie becomes predicated on him trying to get her to ask him to kiss him. And finally, he stays in Camelot's court against her will. Arthur, who's played by Sean Connery, and here we have that dynamic love triangle where you have the young woman who has daddy issues married to the much older man who's still very lovable and amenable, and she really doesn't want to hurt him. But then there's this Lancelot guy who's just terribly hot and really pushy, and he comes to admire the king. And I think this was Julia Ormond's role in the 1990s. She does 3 films where she gets between 2 men who really care a lot about each other. And this is the end of Connery's acting career. In fact, he does this film, and then he does Dragonheart, and then he stops acting.
I like Dragonheart.
Dragonheart's very good. And I mean, Sean Connery did tons of medieval movies. He did quite a few. In fact, when I teach my course, Transformations of Medieval Literature, it's Spot Sean Connery in which film?
Robin and Marion.
Robin and Marion. He is Richard the Lionheart at the very end of Dances with Trees.
Dances with Trees.
That's right. That would be Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves.
Yeah.
And when he gets off his horse, the cinema always erupted into applause. I worked at a cinema when it came out.
He wasn't... If I remember correctly, his name wasn't on the credits at the beginning because they didn't want
anyone to know.
Yeah.
And they wanted that spontaneous reaction when he says, hold, and he gets off the horse. And so he does all of these films, but as King Arthur, they make him strong, older, very soft, very sensitive. He loves Guinevere. But at the end of that film, or towards the very end of the film, the lead-up has been this sexual tension between Guinevere and Lancelot. And she finally asks him to kiss her. Just as he's about to leave, and he realizes that he can best serve Camelot by leaving, that's when Guinevere's like, I'm asking. And she said, will you kiss me? And they engage in this kiss that, in fairness, looks painful because Richard Gere leads with his chin on this one. And it looks like he smashes into her face. And they're snogging. And in walks Arthur. And the look, he literally doubles over with that sense of betrayal. And then you see him straighten up and the look in his face. And he puts her on trial for adultery. And Lancelot is also there, and just at that moment of that trial, Maligant, evil nasty Maligant, who they can't seem to actually kill any time in this movie, shows up and...
Which means somebody actually read Chrétien de Troyes.
Right, but for like 5 minutes.
Okay.
And only took bits out of Chrétien de Troyes. Because it does have some allusions to Chrétien de Troyes. And Maligant demands that Arthur surrender to him. And Arthur is about to, and then he says, for Camelot, he stands up in his non-armored self. And Maligant,
which is a mistake.
It is a big mistake, because Maligant takes a crossbow and plants 3 bolts in his chest.
But fortunately, Arthur lives long enough to be able to hand his kingdom
and his wife
over to
Lancelot. And it really is the sense that Guinevere is an object and Camelot is an object.
It's a happy ending.
It's happy insofar as Lancelot gets what he wants, and they have this scene where Arthur is sent out to see his body burned, which actually ends that once and future king trope, because that movie's very Christian. There's a lot of Christian iconography in that movie. And in fairness, Arthur doesn't do an awful lot in the movie at all.
But then Arthur doesn't do an awful lot in some of the romances either.
That's true. And in this one, it really is far closer to the idea of the Knight of the Cart. But that whole insistence that Lancelot is just trying to get Guinevere to finally consent is highly problematic now. Plus, the costumes Oh my gosh. First of all,
I thought you loved this film.
I hate this movie.
I would never have even brought it up if I knew this is your true feeling.
Galactica. It is the Arthurian Battlestar Galactica with those costumes. But it has a really good cast too, because Liam Cunningham plays Agravain, and you have Ben Cross as Malagant. And I mean, I do love Sean Connery.
So now let's turn from Lancelot and Guinevere to Tristan and Iseult.
Okay.
Believe it or not, there are at least 17 film adaptations of the Tristan and Iseult story. But 3 of them are silent films, which neither of us have seen. 10 are film performances of the Wagner opera. And 1, Eternal Return, is a modern adaptation of the tale. And that's the only one of the films that is arguably a classic. The Eternal Return is a French film directed by Jean Denois from a screenplay by the distinguished French surrealist poet and filmmaker Jean Cocteau. Because it was released in 1943, it has come under scrutiny for possible elements of Nazi propaganda. I don't see any, except for possibly that the 2 lovers are both very blonde and everyone else in the movie is dark-haired. It is famed for her golden hair, and the blondes are the only characters in the movie who die in the end. So you can make of that what you want. It also struck me that Cocteau based his screenplay on Joseph Bédier's reconstruction of the medieval legend rather than on Wagner's opera. So this is very much a French take on the Tristan story. Although the movie is set in the France of 1943, but thankfully without any references to the Nazi occupation, and the lovers are given the more fashionable names of Patrice and Nathalie, The Eternal Return is arguably the most faithful cinematic rendition of the medieval story. It's not a medieval movie, but it's a movie that's worth a viewing. I'm afraid I'm going to be less enthusiastic about the other films. Over the last couple of weeks, I've watched 4 Tristan and Iseult movies set in the Middle Ages. In chronological order of release, they are Love Spell, also released as Tristan and Iseult, 1979. The director was Tom Donovan, with Kate Mulgrew, Richard Burton, and Nicholas Clay. Fire and Sword, The Legend of Tristan and Iseult, a German production, 1982, which was released in Germany as Feuer und Schwert, directed by Veit von Fürstenberg, with Christoph Waltz, Antonia Fraser, and Lee Lawson. In the Shadow of the Raven, an Icelandic production, 1988, directed by Raven Gunnlaugsson, with Rena Brynolfsson and Tina Gunnlaugsdotter. And finally, a Hollywood production, Tristan and Isolde, 2006, directed by Kevin Reynolds, with James Franco, Sophia Myles, and Rufus Sewell. So let's talk about Love Spell. And this is a movie with a really good cast. Richard Burton as King Mark, Kate Mulgrew as Iseult, and your favorite, Nicholas Clay as Tristan.
Straight off of Excalibur.
Yeah, Kate, once you star as a medieval adulterer, you get typecast.
Yeah, and that's pretty much it, yes.
Conversely, Richard Burton, who played King Arthur in the Broadway production of Camelot, now gets to be cuckolded as King Mark, which really goes counter to typecasting. In an interview, Julie Andrews was asked about playing opposite Burton in the show, and she said that it took all of her willpower to resist his charms, despite being happily married. She added that she may have been the only female member of the show he didn't sleep with. But the Burton of Love Spell was a couple of decades older and a lot worse for wear. The Boston Globe movie review is perfect for this. Richard Burton as King Mark looks as if he woke up from a long day's journey into night, hopped into a leather tunic, and began reading his lines from cue cards. And that's absolutely true.
It is absolutely true.
Kate Mulgrew as Iseult has the sparkling face of a preppy on a junior year abroad program, and she is so perky in this.
Well, I actually, I disagree a little bit with that, but read the rest of it and we'll explain why.
And Nicholas Clay as Tristan has the fizz of a flat Guinness.
Now that's true, because he can't act his way out of a wet paper bag.
And his expression never changes.
At all. And it's exactly the same as what it was in Lancelot is in Excalibur. The only difference is in this, he's not in armor. He's in badly constructed leather stuff.
Yeah.
Yes.
In the same year that Love Spell was released to the theaters, German director Veit von Furstenberg was completing production of another Tristan movie, Feuer und Schwert, Die Legende von Tristan und Iseult, and that is released in the U.S. as Fire and Sword in dub. And in this movie, we have a very, very young Christoph Waltz, Antonia Perez, who I've never heard of, Peter Firth, and Lee Lawson. And the movie is kind of odd because the movie is, in fact, probably the most faithful rendition of the story to the medieval legend.
It's just bad.
It's just a bad film. It's turgid. It looks like it was filmed without any budget whatsoever. And the
film editing is basically a pair of scissors.
Maybe it's because of the dubbing, but everybody can't act in this film.
Well, and it's funny because even when we talk about Kate Mulgrew, I love Kate Mulgrew, and I think she's wonderful, just not as Isolde. And they give her a
for one thing, Isolde is blonde.
Well, there's that. Yes. Nobody in that movie is blonde.
Nobody in that movie is blonde. So in this particular movie, the most interesting thing in it is that Isolde is in love with Tristan. Tristan is resisting.
As hard as he can.
As hard as he can. As hard as Christoph Waltz can. Possibly. And so what Isolde does is she prepares the love potion.
For him.
For him.
Yes.
And she slips... She basically date rapes him.
Yeah, she slips him a Mickey.
Yeah, she does.
And he realizes it, and he says, "What have you done? What have you given me?" And she says, "Well, there's no point in resisting it." And that's a very odd scene anyway. I mean, it is uncomfortable, because yes, he is not consenting.
No, because he really wants to be loyal to his uncle.
Exactly. And in that particular scene, you then have the moment where they get naked. And we don't actually see them getting there, but we do see them naked, at which point Branya comes in and is very close.
Oh, God, I can't believe that scene.
She's over them, looking at them, like, right up against them, and she says something about the wind has made the ship still, and she sits back and watches while they have sex.
I was wondering if she was going to take out a notebook to
start taking notes. Can I just make a couple
move a little bit to the left?
To the left. It is a weird and awkward scene, but it is again problematic that in that she is absolutely the one who doses Tristan.
Yes.
And she makes that decision.
I know you really like Kate Mulgrew as an actress, and Antonia Presser is not nearly in her class, but her Isolde seems to me much more like the Isolde of the medieval legend, just as Fire and Sword is a more faithful adaptation than Love Spell is.
I mean, Kate Mulgrew's Isolde is sparky and fiery and spunky because Kate Mulgrew is, but we actually have this whole interaction with her and Mark first, where she seems to actually really like Mark and she's falling for Mark.
I know it. And this is the only version of the story in which Mark has a greater presence than Tristan. That's not only because Nicholas Clay can't hold his own with Richard Burton, even an old and tired Richard Burton. It's also because the screenplay focuses on Mark. As you point out, the flirtatious exchanges between Burton's Mark and Mulgrew's Isolde in the beginning of the film make her infatuation with Tristan seem to come out of nowhere. And Mark is a sympathetic character. In this version, it is Isolde who is dying of grief and who calls upon Mark to fetch the mortally wounded Tristan to her. And Mark does just that. He tells her that if Tristan is alive, he will bring him back to her. A white sail means that he is aboard the ship. Black sail? He's dead. As they approach the shore of Cornwall, Tristan, for reasons beyond my understanding, tells Mark without any indication of remorse that he and Isolde are passionately in love and have been conducting an adulterous affair behind Mark's back. An enraged Mark orders that the black sail be lowered, and Isolde, who has dragged herself to the highest cliff to watch for the sail, drops to her death on the rocks. The dying Tristan throws himself overboard, and a shocked and remorseful Mark drags him to shore so that he can die next to Iseult. The movie's last scene is not of the two lovers now united in death, but of Mark looking confused and lost, standing alone in the water. Love Spell's DVD cover has a picture of Richard Burton embracing Kate Mulgrew, and that seems so appropriate. Love Spell and Fire and Sword put different spins on the Tristan and Iseult story. Love Spell not only places Mark in the foreground, but it strives for a Celtic feel, emphasized by a score that uses traditional Irish folk tunes. Fire and Sword, also filmed in Ireland, has a more generic 12th century medieval feel. As the passion and violence of its title implies, it is also a grittier vision of the Middle Ages. One critic compared it to Bresson's Lancelot du Lac, but I think that this is giving the movie a bit too much credit. Of all the Tristan movies that I saw, the most unique is the Icelandic film In the Shadow of the Raven. And what it does is it takes the Tristan story and meshes it together with Icelandic sagas.
Interesting.
The year is 1077. Iceland is being Christianized, but the old pagan religion still survives. The film's protagonist is named Tracy. He returns from Norway as a newly ordained priest. Meanwhile, Grim, the foreman on Tracy's farm, discovers a stranded whale. The retainers of a neighbor discovers the whale as well, and you know what happens in Icelandic sagas when two families
argue about the whale.
They fight about it.
But there is an Icelandic saga, Trausty saga, because there's the whole genre of Ridara saga.
Yes.
There are all the variations of the knight's tales done in Icelandic context.
Absolutely. But In the Shadow of the Raven isn't based on the mid-13th century Tristram saga. The plot comes much closer to Romeo and Juliet than it does to Tristan and Isolde. Trausty and Iseult belong to rival families, fighting first over the rights to a stranded whale and then engaging in blood feud. Iseult at first hates Trausty, but comes to love him. Trausty, for his part, has returned to convert the pagans to Christianity and is not really interested in Iseult as a lover until she concocts a love potion. Yes, there is a love potion in this movie. But there is no adultery, just a seriously pissed-off, jilted fiancé. I think we can pass it over. But it is an interesting film, and if you enjoy Icelandic sagas, I think you will like it.
But I really think that these attempts to quote-unquote produce the real story comes to its full culmination in the 2006 Tristan Plus is
okay, and this shows that even if you have a big budget,
you can still
make a really bad movie.
That's right. And that movie has an extraordinary cast.
Well, it has sort of an extraordinary cast because the movie has James Franco as Tristan. Rufus Sewell is my favorite film king Mark. He even beats out Richard Burton. And Henry Cavill, he does a really nice job as
Malort,
as a sort of treacherous friend of Tristan, who should have been really Tristan.
And then, of course, he repents at the end and is reconciled right before he dies.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Sophia Myles is good as Iseult. The problem with the movie is that it is horrible history. It not only isn't following the medieval legend, the movie is just bad history.
It is. And, of course, the film is directed by Kevin Reynolds.
And the executive producer of the film is Ridley Scott.
But, I mean, the 2006 film had the capacity to be good because it does have some really good actors. And the costumes are lovely, perhaps not for the 6th century, because it claims to be set in the context of the Dark Ages. The Romano-Britain... Romans have pulled out.
The Romans have pulled out.
And the oppressors of the Isle of Britain are Ireland. I'm sorry, but a movie that starts with the idea of Ireland oppressing Britain is problematic.
And King Mark is going to unite
All the people of Britain.
Yes, Cornwall is going to be united with the West Saxons, is going to be united with the Picts, and all against the Irish, because the Irish, they're going to take over Britain.
They're going to take over, and they have dominated them. And what's worse about this is the discussion of sometimes it's Celts broadly, sometimes it's the Celts and the Picts, never mind the fact that they were very related in some ways, and Celt doesn't mean what they think it means, and they keep saying it. But then you have the Saxons, they even say the Utes. They've got the Jutes, the Saxons, they've got the Picts, and I think there are probably some Danes in there that they never call them Danes by name. And they're all going to unite the island against the Irish domination?
And it will end with Mark actually uniting
everybody as king, of course.
Yes.
And it's ridiculous premise that really infuses the story with this sense of national identity that isn't part of the original story. And
it's unnecessary.
It's totally unnecessary. But it's not unlike the King Arthur of 2004. And I think that Kevin Reynolds was trying to one-up Jerry Bruckheimer.
Do you think that's what...
I do.
Oh, I just want to know why people look at someone like James Franco and you're assuming that he did a screen test.
I don't assume that at all.
Oh.
Because they don't actually require him to act in that film. It's kind of like Keira Knightley in King Arthur, where she doesn't actually have to act. She just has to run around painted blue.
So, okay.
Leather bikini.
Richard Gere as Lancelot or James Franco as Tristan, which is worse?
Oh, gosh, that's a hard one. I mean, Richard Gere can act. I give him that credit.
He's been good in movies.
Just not that one. And I'm not sure that's his. But the idea of James Franco as Tristan, I don't know that he speaks more than 6 or 7 times in the whole movie.
Which is one of the better things about his performance.
That's true, because otherwise he just stands there.
Yes, looking blank.
Yes.
He gets the Nicholas Clay Award for least expressive.
Yeah, well, that's
Tristan.
true. I would say that he probably watched that movie and said, yes, I'm going to do that kind of a Tristan. And the assumption that this is somehow kind of historical content is problematic on many levels, because neither Tristan and Iseult nor the King Arthur story is historical. They're legends, they're literature, and anytime somebody tries to, quote, find the truth behind the legend, they screw it up.
They screw it up. Yeah, I have no doubt that there is a Celtic Earth text for Tristan, but it's irrelevant, because the Tristan that we know, the story that we know, is a story that's developed in the 12th century, just like the story of Lancelot is a story of the 12th century.
That's created by Chrétien de Troyes. Just like the story of King Arthur probably starts with Welsh folklore. Tristan and Isolde, most likely Welsh folklore, because I've read the Old Irish. There are no Old Irish versions. And as much as Isolde comes from Ireland and Ireland's an antagonist in the original stories, there are no Irish versions of it.
The closest is Finn McCool and his nephew.
But that's just it, is that you have the Irish stories themselves that exist in annals and exist in Middle Irish after being, in some cases, written in Old Irish. But it's probably a Welsh story that was developed and then appropriated and expanded by someone else.
Which is what we get, which is a story that we know and the story that we began with. And that's what we'll end with. So.
Absolutely. And these stories just keep having afterlives continuously because we're fascinated by that idea.
And they're good stories.
They are good stories at their heart.
And let's face it, adultery transcends time.
Absolutely.
So with that I just want to thank you for coming back.
Thank you so much.
And I hope that you'll come back again and we'll talk about torture and cruelty next time.
I hope so, because after all this adultery, I think we're due for some torture and brutality.
I think torture and brutality.
Maybe a little murder.
And murder.
And murder.
And murder. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again. So we are finally done with medieval adultery. Well, we're almost done with medieval adultery. I'll be posting a short episode on the film version of Kristen's Lavransdatter. After that, I promise no more adultery. We will be returning to the Crusades with an episode with Nick Morton on Saladin's virtual annihilation of the fighting forces of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the Battle of Hattin, and then one with Dr. Steve Tibble on his new book about criminal crusaders. I hope you'll be able to join us. Until then, bye for now.